Everybody knows Henry Ford as the industrial genius who put America on wheels, the symbol of progress, the man who built a whole new industrial age. But here's the kicker. This was also a man whose ideas Hitler admired so much that he kept a portrait of Ford hanging in his office. A man who paid his workers big money for the time, but in return he was convinced he had the right to walk into their homes, watch their private lives, and turn working for him into something close to slavery. Behind the face of the great innovator was a deeply toxic man, a man who terrorized his own son, who'd explode into uncontrollable rage, who believed in anti-Semitic conspiracies and used his fame to spread that poison across all of America. And you know what? All those great inventions of his weren't really his. Let's start with this. Henry Ford had an 8th grade education, and if he'd been the only one running his company, it probably never would have built a single car. Another executive named James Couzens basically forced Ford to bring the Model A to market. Without him, Ford probably would have run the company into the ground, refusing to ship a product until it was perfect. The Model A wasn't a great car, sure, but it still found buyers, people who'd never owned a car before, and the company finally started making its first real money. And in his hunt for the perfect product, Ford worked his way through the alphabet, model by model, constantly tweaking and improving the design, until he got to the letter T. Henry was a man of ideas, no question. He grew up on a farm, and he hated farm work. It was repetitive, and it was brutal on the body. As a kid, to get out of it, he'd work in the field for about an hour, head home to get a drink of water, and just vanish. They'd find him later trying to figure out how a watch worked, or some piece of farm equipment. Henry despised horses, called them dangerous and mean. Milk disgusted him. He even thought chicken was unfit to eat, and at 16, when he talked his father into letting him go to Detroit to find work as an engineer, in this almost poetic moment, the man who would transform American transportation had to walk nearly 10 miles into the city on foot. Ford also saw farm life as isolating, so he wanted a car a moderately successful farmer could actually afford, one that would bring mobility and freedom to rural America. And that car turned out to be the Model T. It was a carefully engineered, genuinely innovative machine. While most cars were getting heavier and heavier, the Model T was light, just half a ton. It could hit about 45 miles an hour, and if it broke down, the owner could fix it himself. And look, I'm not gonna bury you in technical details, I'll just say this. Ford designed it to handle America's rural roads, which back then were mostly mud, slush and gravel, and it could ride right in the ruts left by horse-drawn wagons. You could even throw a belt over the axle and use it as a portable engine to run farm equipment. And in 1908, all of this could be yours for $850, while comparable cars were going for more than $1,000. And once Ford switched to assembly line mass production at his Highland Park plant, that price started dropping almost every single year, down to $490 by 1916. And by that point, more than half the cars in America were Ford Model Ts, used not just as family cars, but as tractors, fire trucks, and field hospitals. You can't overstate what this car did to America. Rural families used to be literally tied to their land because horses tired out fast. And I mean that literally. If you had a relative living 20 miles away, you might not see them for decades. For these people, the car cracked the world wide open. It gave them a real sense of freedom, of happiness. It connected folks with America's wild country, let city people drive out into the woods, gave better access to medical care for those living far from it. It even created the whole idea of the vacation. The Model T also kicked off a sexual revolution. See, before, courting happened in front of the family, or at least inside the same town. But take a girl out on a date in a car, and suddenly you and your sweetheart could get far away from prying eyes, basically into your own private room. This got so famous that one writer joked half a whole generation was conceived in a Model T. Let that sink in for a second. This car turned Henry Ford into a literal superstar. Books, magazine profiles, they painted him as a genius inventor and a business wizard. So when his team of engineers surprises him with a new prototype, an updated Model T with a sleeker body, Ford walks a slow circle around it, looking it over, then opens the driver's door like he's about to climb in. And instead, he rips it clean off. Then he tears off the passenger door, smashes the windshield, kicks in the fenders, shatters both headlights. In stunned silence, the team watches Henry Ford destroy their gift, the thing they'd poured so much work into. But with that, Ford makes one thing crystal clear. This is his company, and the Model T is the perfect car. Even though the truth is, Ford didn't design the Model T alone. He was passionate about it, sure, and he led the project, but he did it with a whole team of engineers. And even the assembly line wasn't Ford's idea. Now here's where it gets interesting. That idea was pushed by his lead engineer, Charles Sorensen. Back in 1910, he ran a demonstration, dragged a Model T chassis on a rope across the factory floor, while workers stood along the line, adding parts as it went by. After that, they rolled the same system out to engines, wheels, fenders, and pretty soon Ford's Highland Park plant became the first true mass production line in history. Parts moved past the workers on belts or on hooks, and each person did just one task, with their tools and materials right there within reach. One guy might set a bolt, the next guy down the line tightened it. That approach cut production time from over 12 hours down to 93 minutes. But the workers, they hated that line. They stood in one spot for hours, doing dumb, dehumanizing work in deafening noise. Retention collapsed. 8 out of every 9 workers were quitting within days. So, again, it was Cousins who convinced Ford to raise the minimum wage from $2.34 a day all the way to $5 a day. And to bring in a 40-hour work week, and to squeeze every last drop of good press out of it, they started telling the papers this wasn't just a raise, it was a plan to share the company's profits with the workers, and people lost their minds. Within days, 100,000 people were standing outside in the freezing cold, demanding a job. Sometimes the crowd got so wild it tried to storm the gates, and the plant's security would turn fire hoses on them. By the way, Ford's workforce was made up, in huge part, of recent immigrants. Everyone from Eastern Europeans and Scandinavians to Japanese and Arab Muslims. And around 35% of Ford's employees were black. And while they more often got stuck with the more dangerous jobs, the Ford Motor Company was unusual for its time. It had black managers with the authority to hire and fire white workers under them. Though, and I just came across this, that was most likely done so white workers wouldn't feel the urge to band together with black workers and form unions. But for all of that, that famous $5 wage came with some seriously heavy strings attached. Immigrant employees were required to attend English classes and lessons in civics, and when they finished, they took part in this strange ritual called the Ford melting pot. Graduates would show up to the ceremony in their traditional national costumes, march into a giant decorative cauldron, and come out the other side in suits waving American flags. And here's the thing, if you were going to work at a Ford plant, you had to live by Ford's rules, even off the clock. Henry Ford despised alcohol and smoking, and he banned both for his workers. He also demanded they live by his standards of decency. Couples living together only after marriage, no taking in boarders, because to him, that kind of shared living was a straight shot to affairs, drinking and moral decay. All over Detroit, Ford had a team of inspectors who spied on his workers at home. They'd peek through windows or show up unannounced for inspections you couldn't refuse. If they found traces of alcohol, if they found a boarder, stranger who wasn't family, or even if the house just wasn't clean enough by Henry's standards, the inspectors would issue a warning and knock the workers' pay back down to $2.34. And if those problems weren't fixed by the next visit, the person got fired, because there were always new people lining up for that $5 a day. And a couple years later, Ford got himself a personal attack dog, Harry Bennett, former Navy man, amateur boxer. First thing Harry did when he showed up at the plant, he got into it with a guy and punched him in the throat. As head of security, he basically ran the factory. He was rich, kept lions, and walked them on a leash to intimidate the workers. Him and his crew, boxers, athletes, small-time thugs, they spied on the workers too. If anybody so much as whispered the word union, they'd get beaten in a back room. Harry would also fire people for spending too long in the bathroom, or for owning a car that wasn't a Ford. Henry Ford also had Bennett spy on his own son, Edsel, the favorite target of every one of his father's outbursts. Everybody at the plant loved Edsel. He was quiet, fair, kind, a real team player. And while he didn't have his father's gift for engineering, he loved cars. He knew the company inside and out, and he had a real feel for what modern buyers wanted. But his education and his upper-class standing, which his own father had handed him, only pushed him further away. Edsel ran with the sons of wealthy men. He smoked, he drank. To Henry Ford, his son became the embodiment of everything he hated about the modern era. Loose morals, short skirts, cocktail parties, the theater. And even though Ford handed Edsel the presidency in 1919, the real decisions were still his. He'd cut Edsel off in meetings, humiliate him, and when Edsel wasn't home, he'd burst in and smash his liquor bottles with a cane. One time, while Edsel was working on a new engine, Ford invited him to come see a new metal scrapping machine at the plant. And to Edsel's horror, the very first thing they fed into that machine was his new engine. Part of all this was an attempt to provoke Edsel to draw out that same cruelty and rage Henry Ford himself was famous for. He thought his son was weak, and he wanted to toughen him up. But instead, it just broke Edsel. When Edsel told him he had stomach cancer, Ford started saying it was his own fault, bad lifestyle. If he'd just stop eating dairy and exercise more, it'd all clear up. But no. Edsel Ford died at 49. Still, for all the dark shades of Henry Ford's character, and even with him inspecting his workers' homes, most of his employees praised his social programs, because at the end of the day, that $5 day really did change their lives.